Hi, I'm Kristen Eckenwiler, and I'm delighted to be with you during this time where we're going to talk about reading. We're going to talk about reading and how to teach reading, and that is from the emergent, not reading at all level, to even people that are struggling to learn to read. And I love to minister to people at any stage of the learning process. And so if you find that you have an older child or even an adult that might be struggling, I hope that you can glean something from this information. My name is Kristen Eckenwiler, and I am a reading specialist, and I've been doing this for quite a while now. And so I hope that if you have questions, you'll forward them to him, and I'll put our website up here at the very end. All right, so let's get started. So this is All You Need to Teach Reading, Even a Struggling Reader, and I want to just talk to you briefly about where reading all begins. And we call that emergent literacy, and that is when we are speaking to our children, when we're making noises, when we're making sounds of our language, mom, 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 mommy. Things like that, when we're trying to get them to understand the sounds and how we put those together. That's where literacy starts, long before we ever introduce the printed material. And that is usually when we're like reading to our babies, saying sounds to them, holding books. They see what it means to hold a book upright and read from left to right and from the top to the bottom. So all of that is part of reading and part of learning to read. And that usually happens before they start kindergarten. So where did the idea come that there was a benchmark or some goal that we were trying to get to with reading? And that came when our country started to slide a little bit in the reading. And we were wondering what was going on. And so a panel was commissioned by Congress. It was known as the National Reading Panel. It was people just like myself. My husband is also a reading specialist. And they came together and said, okay, what are proficient readers doing? And so we came up with what's known as the Big Five. And many of you will have heard of probably 4 of these 5. And I'll go over each of these in depth. So they are phonemic awareness. You'll see the word phone in that word. Phonemic awareness. Phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. So phonemic awareness is often unheard of. It is not phonics. Let's talk about what it is exactly. So phonemic awareness is being aware of sounds, and a phoneme is the smallest unit of sound in the English language. B, a, f, ch. Those are all sounds, and by themselves they have no meaning whatsoever. They're just sounds. Now if you think about it, it's a code. It's a code that we give our language in America and when it comes to speaking English. Some parents will say that my child can hear fine. It doesn't show up on a hearing test. It's all about neurological processing, and so it's what they process after they've actually heard it, after they have the information has gone into their brains. A phoneme can be tested in the dark, and I only throw that in there to differentiate between it and phonics, because phonics I would need letters and letter combinations in order to give the sounds that they make. This is not letters and letter combinations. This is just sounds. So I might say, who picked you up from school today? Dad. What's the last sound you hear in that word? So they're producing the word and they're producing the sound that they are processing. We'd say that it's different from phonics because there is no letter recognition, and again, it does not show up on a hearing test. There are adults that we test in phonemic awareness. So if you have a high schooler or a middle schooler that's still struggling, as a reading specialist, I would absolutely assess them in the area of phonemic awareness to see if they were processing all the sounds of the language. I'm getting a little ahead of myself when I tell you that in the English language, there are 44 sounds. In our language, there are 21 non-negotiable sounds that you should be processing, and some of those might surprise you because they are at the beginning of the word, at the end of the word, in the middle of the word. I'll elaborate a little bit more. Many claim that this is the #1 predictor of reading success because of those 5 that I mentioned: phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. Phonemic awareness will put holes in each of those other 4 if you're not processing the sounds correctly, and I'll make that connection as I move through these 5. This is started in those emergent literacy years when we start giving them sounds. It's interesting because Sally Shaywitz, she wrote the book Overcoming Dyslexia. It's a great read. And for those of you, I'm going to do a whole other workshop on dyslexia, but dyslexia is an umbrella term for a neurological processing challenge. And that's kind of what this is. Auditory processing. Some of your children may have already been tested and you know that they have an auditory processing challenge or a deficit in the phonological component of language. There's that word, that phonological word again, in phonemic awareness, being aware of the sounds. We hoped that these kids would be mastering these things as they moved up through the grade levels, but this study that Sally did was remarkable. So we started looking at kids as they were leaving the kindergarten grade, and you'll see on the scale, they were all headed in the right direction. The children on the dotted line are not processing all of those sounds. But what we noticed the older they got is that the gap got bigger. And so, yes, they were progressing. You do see they do a climb in their knowledge. But the kids that were processing all the sounds as they go into the 6th grade are reading on grade level, where the kids who were not processing all the sounds, you'll see they came in at an average of the 2nd grade, 4th month. So that's pretty substantially behind when you're going into 6th grade. It was a great research that pointed to this deficit being very important to the act of reading, even as they got older. All right, so that's phonemic awareness, being aware of the sounds of our language. So let's talk some about phonics. Phonics is the relationship between those sounds and the letters and the letter combinations that represent those sounds. And so, well, what does that mean? Again, 44 sounds in the English language, over 500 ways to spell those sounds. I worked in Florida for years with kids with ESL, learning English as a second language. The fact that we have such a melting pot of languages makes it very challenging to pick up English as a second language. And so lots of people struggle with phonics. And I dare say some of you that are teaching reading for the first time, you don't even know all these phonics rules. And some of my colleagues would disagree with me, but I am a firm believer that you can learn to read without learning all of these rules. In fact, kids that struggle with the area of phonics, when you tell them that they are rules, there's a whole lot of conflict going on there because a rule is not supposed to be broken. Oh, but then we give them all these exceptions. I love to tell parents, if you teach your kids that about 80% of the time this will apply, and then the other 20% of the time we're just going to have to memorize those things because they don't fit into this category. And so that's a little bit of a safety net for them to not be afraid to mispronounce words or apply a rule that doesn't work to something that they're seeing for the first time. Phonics instruction usually begins in kindergarten, and we hope that it's mastered by the end of 3rd grade. Notice I said hope. We hope that it's mastered by the end of 3rd grade. It's not always. In fact, most of the people that I talk to have kids that are older than 3rd grade. So we want to be particularly mindful of people who are struggling beyond 3rd grade, and I just don't think that there should be a benchmark for when we actually master stuff like this. We don't expect our children to walk and talk at the same time, so why we expect them to have all this mastered by the end of 3rd grade is beyond this reading specialist comprehension. So what I'm trying to do here is give you a benchmark that we hope that developmentally, by the time they hit the age that they are in the 3rd grade, that we're ready to stop learning how to read and then move into what we refer to as reading to learn. So that's phonics. So we have phonemic awareness, which is the sounds and the letter combinations that make those sounds, and then we have phonics. Now, track with me if you will. If I have a student that is not processing the short vowel sounds, like a, and I, then pan, pen, and pin are the same word when I process them auditorily. Now I start to do phonics, and I hold up symbols, the code of our language. I makes I, A makes a, E makes e. And I hold up the word pan, pen, and pin. It's all the same word to them. So now their spelling is atrocious. They're guessing it so much because they don't know what code to use because they're not processing those sounds. So phonemic awareness, putting great holes in my phonics. So let's move on to sight words. Now, you'll notice that under the big five, I didn't mention sight words, but sight words fall under the umbrella of fluency. And I'm going to unpackage fluency a little bit more. But let's talk about sight words for a minute. Some people think that they're whole language. What does that even mean? Well, in the area of reading, we have people that believe in the whole language approach, where some of you were even taught this way, where we can't use phonics on all of the words in the English language. There's just too many that break the rules. So we're going to memorize every word. We teach your baby to read by giving them the picture and then the word. We're just going to memorize the words. And so that works for some things, but what about words that you only come across once or twice in a lifetime? How do I decipher those? And so then the pendulum swung back over here to the phonics side of things, where they said, well, you have to be able to sound out words. But then somebody said, sound out the word the, sound out the word of. You can't make sense of that. And so sight words kind of fall under the whole language component of memorization. But there were some great researchers by the name of Dolch and Fry that came up with the most common words in the English language. And the reason why we memorize those words is not necessarily because I can't sound them out or that I can. It's that I don't want you to. They show up so frequently in print. I want you to know them when you see them. This is part of the reason why we teach sight words so early on. And in many of your states, they're required to know them before they even get into kindergarten. A lot different than the kindergarten that came about when I was young. So some of them you sound out and some of them you don't. The most common word is the word the or the, depending on where you're from. It shows up about 75 times every 1,000 words. If I'm stopping at all of those, it's very choppy reading. It's not what's known as a fluent reader. And some of you have kids that actually do that. They'll see the word the, and then they'll go f, or t, and you're like, honey, it's a sight word. We've been working on it. It's in the room by the window, and then they get it, the, and then like 3 sentences later, they're like all over again, and that drives you crazy. But there's a reason for that. It's not in their long-term memory. I want them to know that just very quickly when they see these sounds. The top 10 words make up 24% of the written material. That's a lot. And statistically, top 25 make up a third, and the top 100 most common words make up almost 50% of the written language. If you have a student that's stopping at all of those sight words that show up so frequently, then they're just not very fluent readers at all. When I talk about words that show up commonly, some of them aren't as simple as of and is, but all those. Some of them are like the word daughter. Daughter is not an easy word to sound out by any means, but it is a word that we use often in the English language. It is a relationship between a parent and a female child. We don't say, my husband's female offspring. We just don't say that. We use the word daughter to relay meaning, and we use it often. And there are other words like that, like through, thought, and though. We use those words often, and they have a lot of the same letter and letter combinations. Many of your kids will see off and say of. Some of your kids will see the and say a or of. Some of that is common as they start to work out these connecting words that are in sentences and in our language. So sight words fall under that umbrella of fluency. Well, why? Well, fluency measures 3 different components. I have a lot of light bulb moments when I talk about fluency, because I'll have parents come to me and talk about a comprehension deficit or a student who's challenged in understanding what they're reading. So much of that falls under this area of fluency and not comprehension at all. So let's talk about the 3 components that we look at under fluency. One of them is reading speed. Now, I like to tell parents it's not a race, but nobody likes to listen to a really slow and methodical reader. A typical 3rd grader will read about 100 words per minute, where a typical adult might read 250 to 300 words per minute. We're not all typical. I tend to be a much slower reader, especially than my husband, and I didn't even realize that until we were reading something online one day, and he was just moving through it very quickly. And I've looked at some of the research behind that. Some of it's fun, some of it's fascinating. Women tend to look for details where men are much more, some of them will look at the headlines and just fill in details. And not everyone is like that. Some women read that way. Anyway, the idea is that it's not a race, but my reading speed needs to be where it should be for my understanding. When I read too fast or too slow, what gets affected by that? Well, my accuracy does. And accuracy is when I have kids that insert things, guess at words, omit things. That's my favorite, is when they insert words. They'll see the beginning and they'll just guess at the rest of it, and they don't care that it doesn't make sense in the sentence. They just guess at those things. And those are called inaccuracies. Now, for instance, if I have a student that has a question about the story, and the story actually said that it was a red ball, and they read that it was a red barn, well, then they're going to answer the question incorrectly because they had an inaccuracy. Now, that doesn't fall under comprehension. Yes, they got it wrong, but it was an inaccuracy, and that falls under fluency. So these areas of fluency absolutely affect comprehension, but it is an inaccuracy and it falls under fluency. Now, I have some parents that will ask me, well, she sees of and says the, or she sees off and says of. Here's the rule of thumb when it comes to assessing how your child is doing. So as a reading specialist, if it doesn't change the meaning of what they're reading, then it's not considered a mistake. It's very natural for our brains to see wonderful and read good, to see beautiful and read pretty. It's natural for us to do that, and good readers often do that. Our brains are amazing. So when your kids are experimenting, or their brain is experimenting with reading itself, don't stop them at every mistake. If they're reading and they make a mistake and you catch it, see what their understanding is of the material. If it doesn't change the meaning of what they're reading, then it's not considered a mistake. So accuracy, first of all, reading speed and accuracy, and prosody is the third thing that we measure under this area of fluency. What is prosody? Well, we borrow that word prose from music. There is a rhythm to our language. There is a rhythm to every language. I might not speak Chinese, but I know it when I hear it. Same thing with English. There is a rhythm. There is a reason why we have exclamation points and question marks and commas. And if your children don't care about any of that, they're just blowing by that, and they could change the whole meaning of what they're reading. There's lots of examples out there. Let's go eat, Grandma. Let's go eat, Grandma. Am I taking her to lunch, or am I eating her for lunch? And so I can change the meaning by avoiding paying attention to any of those things that the author is giving me to imply meaning. They give us exclamation points so that we get excited or scared, or they give us question marks so that we know it's a question and it's not a statement. Some of your kids will blow by a paragraph break when the whole meaning of what I'm talking about is gone, and you have no idea what they're talking about, and they don't care because you just asked them to read from this page to this page. So prosody matters. Are they reading with voice inflection? What contributes to fluency? Well, there are several things that contribute to fluency. Decoding skills. Well, what are decoding skills? Well, I just talked about those under phonics. There is a code to our language, and if they are spending all their time decoding those words, they do not read fluently when those decoding skills are compromised. Vocabulary. What happens when we get to words that we don't know? Kids often will skip them or guess at them, and that will affect their fluency for certain. Sight words, those are those words, if they're stopping at every one of them, then they're challenged in their ability to read fluently. The ability to self-monitor. Now, I said, if I ask them to read from this page to this page, if you and I do that, often our minds will wander, or we can read great and have no idea what we're reading. We're not really paying attention. If we get to the bottom of that page, what do? Well, normally we'll just reread it. But that's the ability to self-monitor. Kids that aren't self-monitoring, they are not fluent readers. And then practice. For all my music people out there, if I give you a piece of music to play, it sounds like the first time you play it when you play it for the first time. And this is a code as well. This is a code in language. And so the number one strategy to use when I am teaching reading, if I want my reader to be a fluent reader, is practice. And so they hear the language, they practice it, they decode it, and then have them read it again. And so when I'm working with kids, often I'll do it in threefold. I'll say, I want you to follow along while I read this sentence. And then they'll follow along and I read it. They can hear the language. They're seeing words maybe that they were afraid of. They'll see how I sound it out and they'll read it. They'll follow along as I read it. The second time I might say, let's choral read this, where we read together. So we read it together, just like in a choir. I won't read as slow as they do, but I won't read as fast as I normally would. I want a sweet medium where they can keep up with me, hear again how it sounded out, hear again the rhythm of that sentence, and then on the third time, I'm going to ask them to read it. You don't want to do a whole chapter that way, but it is okay daily to do maybe a paragraph as you work on those skills in fluency. Repeated reading is the number one way to increase fluency. In the area of vocabulary, it's very important to note that our kids are learning vocabulary very quickly when they're very young. Vocabulary knowledge and reading achievement are very closely related. Now, I talked earlier about let's get them reading and then we read to learn. Well, when they're good readers, then they're picking up lots of vocabulary because they learn so many words within context of what they're reading. Students' vocabulary grows about 7 to 10 words a day. That's a lot. And it's doing that without you teaching it explicitly. So most words are taught incidentally through music, through conversation, through TV shows, stories that they read, all of that. Reading has the largest impact on reading development, and that's if they're being read to, not just reading to themselves. So it's okay to let your kids listen to some books on tape or science that's been pre-recorded or even a fiction book. It's okay. They're learning lots about the rhythm and the stops and the voice inflection when they listen to these books that have been recorded. Vocabulary is a big deal, and there's a lot of curriculum that's out there to teach vocabulary, but keep in mind that reading and thinking aloud, so if you get to a word that you know and you know your child doesn't, you think out loud. You say, well, the cows meandered down the path. Well, meandered makes me think of moving very slowly. It implies that they're not in a hurry, and so I can just kind of see these cows moving very slowly, maybe a step or two a minute. And so I'm thinking out loud, and that is actually giving them vocabulary as I'm reading. So let's go into comprehension. Let me just back up and make some connections again for you. If I have holes in my phonemic awareness, then I can end up with holes in my phonics. If I end up with holes in my phonics, then let's jump into fluency. I might not know what that word is, so I have to figure out what it is within context. Is it a pen, or pin? And I have to see within context, what am I talking about? So that makes my reading speed go pretty slow. And so then I make some mistakes, or I'm just not decoding very well, and that's under fluency. Or I know that I read slow, so I'm going to speed up my reading, but I'm going to guess at a lot of things or insert things or even omit things, which are going to affect my comprehension, and I can trace all of those lack of skills back to the holes that we have in phonemic awareness, which is really why we say that it's the number one predictor of reading success, because of what it does to all the other areas of reading. So let's talk about comprehension. Comprehension is very complex. It can be simple recall, was there a dog in the story, to inferring what is implied in what I'm reading, but not stated there. For instance, you go up to a window, there's a glass window, and you slide something through the slot. Where am I? Well, there's a number of places that you could be. You could be at the movie theater, you could be at the bank, you could be at a gas station. I could be at anything that sells tickets. And depending on where you're at in this country, there's a number of other places that you could be. But where I am is dependent on my understanding of where the story has taken me and where it is going. And that is inferring. And that affects comprehension. Other things affect comprehension, like physical and emotional well-being. If you have a student that's hungry, This is why we studied this back in the public schools, and then we started feeding them, because when they were hungry, they didn't want to learn. They couldn't understand. All they knew is that they were physically hungry and they were in pain. Nowadays, for those of you that homeschool, those of you that are helping your kids at home, there could be some injustice that you're not even aware of that has happened between siblings, or that has happened because of something that you said and didn't mean, or they took the wrong way. All of these things bring them to the table with a physical or emotional well-being that is altered, and they don't want to listen to what you have to say. They don't care about reading. Reading is stupid. So physical and emotional state. Decoding skills, again, can affect their comprehension. Reading is kind of like riding a bike, and so if I'm spending all my time balancing, pedaling, focusing on where I'm going, I can't tell you what I've seen as I rode down the street, because I'm spending all my time on the mechanics of riding a bike. If I spend all my time on the mechanics or the phonics and decoding of the language, I can get to the bottom of the page and I have no idea what I've just read. There are some kids that do that and understand exactly what they've read, so it's not across the board. And background knowledge. You know, if there's vocabulary that I'm bumping into, if I don't know what a horizon is, I'm really not going to understand what I'm reading, because horizon has a great meaning. And so I might read it perfectly fine, but I don't understand it because I don't know what the word is. So vocabulary contributes to comprehension. Motivation and interest. There are a lot of people out there that are doing grade by box, and there'll be readers in some of those things that some of your kids are just not interested in some of those stories. Years ago, I got to be part of a study with young kids to find out, why are little boys not reading as well as little girls? Well, I think all kids under the age of 10 have ADHD. They want to play and they want to move and they don't want to sit and focus for hours at a time. But little boys in particular weren't interested in reading about bubbles or ponies or best friends. They were not interested. And so we started to write a lot of nonfiction at that primer level where they're just learning to read. And so now they're reading about weapons and outdoors and frogs and snakes and boogers, and they loved all of that. And so interest really does affect comprehension and your desire to even understand what you're reading. So if you have a child that's really struggling, see what they're interested in. Get books that they're interested in. You can get books at their reading level. You can get books above their reading level. I'm going to tell you how to figure out what their reading level is in just a minute. Experience inferring. You thinking aloud. You helping them through what's not written on the page and understanding. Give them experience with that so that when they're approaching words or situations in a story that they need to infer, they know how to do that. Self-monitoring, we talked about that. And the ability to discuss, talk to your kids about what they're reading. Tell me what's happening in the chapter. Tell me who your favorite character is. What if they didn't do that? How do you think the story would change? Just talking to them about what they're reading really gives them experience with stories and understanding. And exposure to comprehension enhancement activities. Look, I just think that we just do a big disservice when we teach comprehension. We do that by having them read something and answering questions. That is not how we teach comprehension. That is comprehension. So what if I have a student that's not able to do that? Well, comprehension enhancement activities, multi-sensory, getting this information into their little brains, making them connect with what they're reading, that's how we do it. I'm going to give you an example of one. This is known as a directed reading thinking activity, or a DRTA. This is a book that some of you will be familiar with. Jane Yolen is a fabulous author, and her book is very popular. So what I might do with a nonfiction book and or a chapter that I'm reading in science or history, or it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what I'm reading. The idea is that you need to understand what you're looking at. So I would hold up this book and I would ask the question, what does the title tell us? We're just looking at the title. Well, the title is Owl Moon, so I might get them to engage by telling me, well, it has to be at nighttime. What makes you say that? What makes me say that is that owls come out at nighttime, that the moon comes out at nighttime. So I'm getting them engaged. What does the title tell us? What's on the ground? I think it's snow. It has a blue tint, but I think it's snow. What makes you say that? Who are they, in the city or are they in the country? Well, they must be in the country. What makes you say that? Well, there's no city lights, there's no street lights, there's no streets, there's no cars, there's no people, there's no houses, there's no buildings. They must be in the country. Who are the people? I love this question when I do this live with an audience anyway. Who are the people? Well, some people will say, well, they're siblings, or it's a father and son. What makes you say that? Well, look at their stocky, the way they're built, the way that they're looking in their stance. Well, women put on winter clothes and they look kind of stocky too. But I had one mom say, well, no, I know it's a man in the child, because I would never go out in the sun at night or in the snow at night. And that was funny to me. So I'm getting them engaged. Now, as I read this story, they are looking for answers to those questions. They want to know, who are these people? And what are they doing out at night? And what do the owls have anything to do with the story? So I'm giving them a purpose in their reading now that is way different than just saying, come on, let's read this book. It's called Owl Moon, and just reading. And that's I'm directing their reading and their thinking. And that is an enhancement activity for them to understand what it is they're about to read. So that is one way that we teach comprehension. There are 3 very important levels to know when it comes to your reader. There is an independent reading level. So the reading level is not too hard. The sentence structure is not too difficult. The vocabulary they can understand. That is their independent reading level. For your 3rd grader, that could be 1st grade. For your 7th grader, it could be 4th grade. When we hand books to them that are above their independent reading level, they get frustrated because they can't read it. They don't understand it, and they don't like to read. You'll never catch those children just sitting in the living room reading a book, because they're too challenging for them. Their independent reading level, their instructional reading level, that is kind of where we should be teaching them at. Where I can do some think alouds and I can teach them while we're reading material that's slightly above their independent reading level, but where they're able to learn information and reading skills from. That's their instructional reading level. And then the 3rd one is known as the frustration reading level. And that level is way too hard. You're explaining way too much. They're just missing points. The sentence structure is way too difficult. And so even the syllabication is beyond what they're able to handle. The frustration reading level, I often tell parents, that's where you sound like Charlie Brown's teacher. Wah, 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 wah. They just aren't following you, and that is very frustrating. Frustration reading level. So what I want is for parents to be able to know exactly what their students' independent reading level is, their instructional reading level, and their frustration reading level. So that as I'm teaching them and working in these areas of phonemic awareness, of phonics, of fluency, of sight words, of vocabulary, those reading levels will simultaneously move up. So my frustration reading level, well, that gets higher. My instructional reading level goes up. My independent reading level goes up. The mistake we make is making guesses at what those levels are. So that was a lot in a short amount of time, but I've now made you all a mini reading specialist. What I'd like to do is take just a few minutes to tell you about the struggling reader curriculum that we have developed for parents to be empowered to teach in the area of reading and to assess how your child or children are doing. So we have 4 parts to the struggling reader material, which is, we actually have 5 because we test in the area of sight words as well, which falls under that area of fluency. We don't have a vocabulary component because we don't need one. There's plenty of vocabulary curriculum out there. We're looking to figure out what they know in these other areas of reading so that I can teach them what they don't know. And in doing so, we've created a phonemic awareness test. In that test, we actually test those 21 very discrete skills that help you target instruction. It tells you what sounds they know, what sounds they don't know. We move through that, revealing if they have beginning sounds, ending sounds, blending sounds, words in a sentence. It just goes on and on, the sounds that we need to process. We have phonemic awareness materials comes with an assessment that you give your own children. And then beyond that, we have the curriculum that marries right up to that assessment. So you figure out what they don't know, and then you go into the books and you teach them exactly what they don't know. If you want to know a little bit more about this, there is a video on our website, thestrugglingreader.com.net, and it will go into detail more about the curriculum itself. So we have picture cards that we use to teach that, because I don't want to use letters because that's phonics. I need picture cards to see what sounds they're processing and to remediate those. In our phonics material, we give you the ability to assess them in these big phonics ideas: silent E's, L and R controlled vowels, long vowels, short vowels, blends, digraphs, diphthongs, all of those things we put right out in front for parents to be able to assess their own children and those skills, to find out what they know and don't know. So you're not going back into the same phonics curriculum again and again and again, teaching your 8th grader, your 7th grader, your 4th grader things that they already know. I know what they know, and then I can go right into the curriculum and teach them what they don't know. Everything that we do at the Struggling Reader, and we put TSR on our material, so your kids aren't like, oh yeah, we use the Struggling Reader material. It's TSR material, and we named it the Struggling Reader so that we could get parents to stop and talk to us. That's what we're trying to do, but we do have a complete reading curriculum for even your beginner reader. We tell you exactly through a quick start guide that you can look at and download from our website how you would set up a day to teach using this material. We have a whole fluency component where you can assess your child in their reading speed, their accuracy, and if they're reading with prose or prosody. And then we go into those teaching activities, and we use those whether we're doing science or history or a read aloud or nonfiction or fiction. We would record them. We would do lots of different activities so that we could see exactly how we can strengthen those different areas under fluency, like their reading speed and accuracy and prose. Comprehension material, very powerful. The assessment will give you the ability to know what level your child is at independently, instructionally, and frustration. And so the test will give you that information now, it'll give it to you next year, it'll give you the year after, and so on and so forth. And it goes through, it starts at not reading at all, through an 8th grade reading level. Again, we're trying to get students to an 8th grade reading level because then they can go on to read for more information, but then we'll be done teaching them how to read. The material also comes with instructional activities that are phenomenal. They're basically study skills. And that DRTA that I went over, that's in that book as well. Lots of different study skills and comprehension enhancement activities. If you go through every single one of those activities, you have hit on one or two ways that your child best learns. And I think the number one thing that we don't teach our kids is how they learn. And so this will teach them how they learn. The Struggling Reader material comes as a complete set, so you can assess your children in every area. I tell parents it takes me about 20 minutes to give each assessment. It might take you 30. Monday you could assess in phonemic awareness, Tuesday in phonics, Wednesday in sight words, Thursday in fluency, Friday in comprehension. By the end of the week, you know right where they're at, their holes in their strengths in reading. Then you go into the material. We don't want you to test often, maybe every 3 months. It might take a little bit longer. We tell you exactly how to go in and teach using a multi-modality approach to teaching. There are no worksheets here. It's all about using kinesthetic movement, tactile touch, auditory, and visual, and some of our activities include taste and smell. All of these things will help give retrieval mechanisms for them to find the information. Again, best teaching practices by far is a multisensory approach, and that's what we do here. It's the best for all learners, but especially kids that may struggle. But your very capable learner will just, by the time they get to an 8th grade reading level, if you start with this material, it could be in the 3rd grade. They're now reading at an 8th grade reading level because I'm hitting all of those important things using these best teaching practices. There's lots of different combinations that you can put together to have our complete curriculum or part of it. You can visit us at thestrugglingreader.com, and you'll see that we have different bundles. We have a foundation bundle if you just want to start there, where you just get the activity books for phonemic awareness, phonics, and sight words. If you want to just test your children to see where all these holes are, where their holes are in phonemic awareness, where they are in phonics, what their reading speed is, what their reading level is, even what sight words there are 300, and they come with that component 1 through 300, and they're numbered in their in how frequent they are. So of course the number one card would be the or the, and so we go into more difficult words in that last 300, like daughter and through and thought and those types of words. So this will reveal, the testing bundle will reveal what they know and don't know. Now, I only caution you about going back into your material, that this material is what got you where you are now. You don't need our material. You can use the testing bundle just to figure out where the holes are, but just make sure you're adding some kind of other modality of learning to what you're doing. And then the complete bundle, of course, would include all of what I've just mentioned. It would have all of the testing for the 5 areas, and it would have all of the curriculum for those areas, as well as any manipulatives or cards that come with that. It's available both in book form and in digital form. Whether you get one or the other, there's a cost difference, of course, but you would get all of the cards printed in a deck of cards that come with that material. You can use it with all the kids in your homeschool. You can use it for your kids that you are working with after school. We ask that you honor the copyright by not sharing it with the whole neighborhood. But what that means for you, especially if you're homeschooling, is that it's one reading curriculum for all of your children. All of your children. What they do in each book is determined by those assessments. The assessments drive what you do each year. So if I start teaching from kindergarten, I just go in and do activities in phonemic awareness, phonics, and sight words. At the end of kindergarten, I would assess them to find out what they know. That would tell me exactly what I do in first grade. And every year, they get a little bit further in the assessments. They get a little bit further. What I do in second grade is determined by how they assess. If your kids are moving really well through the material, you can assess them during a December break. You don't have to wait for a whole year. What you do each year is determined by those assessments. They're not consumable. And eventually, they'll start to test out of things like sight words and phonemic awareness. And so now you're just working in phonics and comprehension and fluency. And eventually I'll get to where I'm just doing some fluency and comprehension activities with my 7th, 8th grader that they will then apply for the rest of their academic career and beyond. There are still ways that I know that I learn best when I approach new information, that I use those different type of enhancement activities to learn. Anyway, you can go to our website and you can look at the vendor. There's a little how it works video you can watch. There's lots of things you can scroll through. And if you need to contact us, there's a contact button. If for some reason we don't answer you, you can email us directly at thestrugglingreader@gmail.com, and we will get back with you if you have specific questions about the material. Again, the website is thestrugglingreader.com. If you put in .net, it'll take you there too. So thank you for joining me. I hope you feel empowered on your reading journey. It's been a joy.